Hello and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. Today, recording date, it's December 18th, 2015. It's 3:36 p.m. And I'm very excited to have with us today Mark Pugsley. Mark is an attorney. According to his bio, he's a commercial litigator who focuses on fraud. And so the title of the podcast for today is Mormonism and the Culture of Fraud. And, most of my listeners will be familiar with the fact that Utah seems to be a hotbed of activity when it comes to pyramid schemes, scams, Ponzi schemes, securities fraud, etc. And Mark is, I would say a top litigator in Utah on these types of cases. So we won't be digging too much. We'll hear a little bit about Mark's story, but the focus of today isn't going to be really Mark's story. It's more going to be Mark's expertise as a litigator around fraud. And also we're going to just tell the background of how much this goes on in Utah, why it's a problem, why you should care about this. And then we're going to dig in just to some cool stories of maybe 5 or 10 of the top stories that Mark's familiar with that he can share with us in terms of his experience as a litigator. And what we hope you walk away from all this is sort of the ability to detect scams and fraud, the ability to basically understand how they operate at a basic level, a knowledge of what some of the main cases in the past have been, and what you need not only to prevent fraud in your life, but also in the life of loved ones around you, like your parents and others. So that's what it's all about. And Mark Pugsley, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
All right. So let's just start off right off the bat by talking about, why this is important, and more specifically, why this is important for Mormons and for people in Utah.
Okay, sure, John. And I appreciate you letting me come on and talk about this. I feel like this is a growing problem. The FBI estimated in 2010 that Utah had over $1.4 billion in fraud losses. And since then, it's been growing. And the number of cases that I've dealt with in the 21 years that I've been practicing grows all the time. And as I've been doing this for a long time, the one thing I will say is that church seems to come up in almost every case, the LDS church. And there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons that Utah has one of the highest highest number of fraud cases per capita in the country, not the highest, but one of the highest, is because of the Mormon population here. And so there's a lot of things that I think we can talk about that people should keep an eye out for, and kind of warning signs, and we can just go through it.
Okay. So. And I noticed in your kind of show notes that Utah County has a particularly big problem. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Alpine, for some reason, is the hotbed. Ask anybody in law enforcement, FBI, and they'll tell you that Utah County, most of their cases come from Utah County. That said, of the cases that I'm going to talk about today, some of the bigger ones were not Utah County. Some of them were smaller counties up north. Davis, I have one from Davis County, one from Salt Lake, a couple from from Provo and Orem area, and then one actually down south even further. So it's spans the gamut in terms of location, but it seems like Provo, I'd say Alpine in particular, seems to have a large number of people with a lot of money, and everyone's kind of trying to make fast money. And I think some of that has been driven by the multi-level marketing culture that's down there, because a lot of people have made money very quickly. But for some reason, there's a culture down there of trust, and that actually pervades all of these cases, that people think that if someone's in their ward and they have a potential opportunity, they must be a good guy. He's my elders quorum president and he gives good lessons. Therefore, he must be someone I can trust and invest with. And the fact is that's absolutely not true. Whether someone is good in their calling and whether they offer a legitimate investment opportunity are two very different things, and people unfortunately tend to conflate the two.
Yeah.
And that's the problem I keep seeing.
And I also see in your show notes that the church has, in some ways, been largely silent on this issue, or at least they don't talk about it much. I would even bet that in the past, higher church leaders have maybe even been involved sort of behind the scenes in some of this kind of stuff, at least through, endorsing, and maybe they've steered clear of that in the past decade or two. But I know growing up, I heard of many cases where general authorities would sort of behind the scenes endorse various sorts of things. Yeah. But the church, doesn't talk a lot about this. And as you said, people are really trusting. So you listed several questions that are of interest to you in this discussion. And why don't you go ahead and list those off, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. Let me just...
So I can just fill them in. If
I've got
you
a
want.
different outline, so go ahead.
No, it's good.
Okay,
So some of the do you want to talk about them?
Oh, sure. So one of the things I was going to say, John, is a lot of your podcasts are theological, and some of them are historical. This one, I think, is cultural, and these are cultural problems that we'll be talking about. None of them really relate to anything doctrinal or anything about the church, but this is something. There's something about Mormon culture that leads to this problem. And one of the questions that I often ask myself is, if the LDS Church is truly the one true church on the planet, you would think that in fact we would have a much lower incidence of people screwing each other. But the reality is the opposite, and it's very unfortunate. People who are truly living the gospel, I think, ideally would not want to screw their neighbor and defraud them, but that unfortunately happens all the time. The other thing that I think we can talk about, and this actually is more down your line of interest, is why are people so often able to compartmentalize their church life with their business life? And this is something in legal circles, you can ask a lot of lawyers and they'll tell you they see people who are stake presidents and bishops by the weekend, but during the week, they're extremely aggressive businessmen. They're people who are working very hard to do whatever they can to make a quick buck. And it's something that seems to be, you'd think it would be a conflict, but people seem to be able to manage that pretty well. And I don't know. I don't know why that is, but maybe you have a thought about that. I mean,
and then sometimes you've mentioned that there seems to be a culture of wanting to get rich quick, and I have no way of knowing how much that's a Utah thing versus just a human thing. But and it may be that large families play a role in that to some degree. And it's worth wondering whether Mormons are more gullible than maybe other people. I just have no idea. But let's go ahead and dive in. Talk really quickly just about your background and specifically your education and work experience and kind of what brought you to this field.
Okay, sure. I grew up in Salt Lake City. Went to the University of Utah undergrad. Served a mission in probably the best mission in the world. I continue to think that I served the best mission location in the world, which was Fiji, the Fiji Islands.
Oh, fun.
Had a great mission. Then I went away, after I graduated from the U, I went away to graduate school. I got a master's degree and a law degree from Duke University. Then went to Los Angeles, practiced there for about 4 years, and then moved to Salt Lake City. Joined the firm of Ray Quinney Nebeker, and I've been there ever since 1998.
Who was the best basketball player for the Blue Devils that played while you were there?
Oh, well, Christian Laettner and Grant Hill were both playing when I was there, and Bobby Hurley. So I was there during kind of the glory days.
National championships?
Oh, yeah. I was there for 2 national championships.
Nice.
It was a lot of fun.
Okay.
In fact, so, I had a good time.
I had to ask.
So then what happened is when I first moved to Utah, when I worked in Los Angeles, I did a lot of securities litigation. And when I moved to Utah, I began to do the same thing. I didn't know that there was a need for it, but it turned out there was really a need for people who specialized in securities. And so I started doing more and more. And I was going to tell you a story that kind of is the reason I started this website. So I started a website called UtahSecuritiesFraud.com. And what happened? This was probably 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe it was more than that. I don't remember. But there was a family that called me, and we actually had a family connection with them. And I'm just going to call them the Smarts for the purposes of today. They were really nice people, both retired, living in their home that was fully paid for. Then they had been approached one day by someone in their ward who worked for a company called Franklin Squires. Franklin Squires was run by a guy named Rick Kerber, who ran I don't know, I'll call it a scheme. He has been indicted, but he hasn't been convicted. So these are all allegations. But I can tell you that what they told me, which is that they'd been told that if they invested with them, with the Franklin Squires group, they would earn 6% per month on their money, guaranteed. No risk, all the stuff. And you'll hear this over and over, the guarantee. So they attended a party at the flashy home in Alpine of Rick Kerber. They saw Maseratis and Lamborghinis out front, and he's a very flashy guy. They agreed to invest, and unfortunately, they thought the opportunity sounded so good that they took out a mortgage on their house, which had been paid off. So they leveraged their house and they liquidated their 401k and invested literally everything they had with this company. And within months, it was gone. So in May of 2009, Kerber was indicted, and he was charged with operating a Ponzi scheme that took in over $100 million, $50 million of which was lost. And by the time they called me, the Smarts were, keep in mind, they were retired. They had spent all of their retirement money and leveraged their house. So they were in a really bad situation. And unfortunately, in these cases, it's really hard to fix the problem. There's not a lot I can do. It's heartbreaking. I mean, these were retired people who now the husband was going back to bag groceries just to pay the bills. And so at that point, I decided I wanted to start getting the word out. I had been hearing these stories, but this one really hit home to me because these were about the age of my parents. And so I started a website called UtahSecuritiesFraud.com, where I've been tracking these schemes for quite a while now.
All right. Well, that's a good story to kind of kick this off. Why don't we, you've mentioned that Utah has been called the fraud capital of the nation. Why don't you define what affinity fraud is for us, and then we'll talk about Ponzi schemes and
okay. So affinity fraud, many people have heard of Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff, if you remember that story, was a guy who used the Jewish faith in a lot of ways, in his Jewish connections in Florida and in New York, to gain trust. And the same thing happens in Utah. Affinity fraud literally is fraud of your friends, defrauding your friends. And so this happens where someone has a church relationship or a family relationship or some other connection, and they'll use that to gain trust. And so because of that connection, people feel like they're trustworthy and they'll invest with them. So affinity fraud is kind of a broad term that refers to those cases that involve friendships or church relationships. And that's what happens in Utah most of all.
So almost any time you hear about a deal through church, you should almost be concerned, right?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
They're going to be preying on that trust and those relationships. It's almost like a dual relationship. You want your financial world, if possible, to be separate from those relationships that are around religion, right?
Yeah, the thing I've told people many times is if you are being pitched on a deal, and in the context of that pitch, someone casually drops that they're a state president or a bishop or were a bishop, I think you should be done. I think that's the end of the conversation.
Or related to some celebrity in Mormonism, or to some general authority, or a cousin or son-in-law.
This is, you talked about what used to happen. What used to happen is these guys would send free stock to general authorities, and then they would tell all their investors that, Elder so-and-so is an investor in our company, which wasn't technically true. But then the general authorities would have all this stock and they didn't know what to do with it. The church now has changed. They don't allow general authorities to accept free stock anymore because they realized people were using that to gain trust. But people drop names all the time, and you're going to see a lot of these as we talk about them that do exactly that.
And then also using like Harvard or Yale or Wharton or Stanford, right? Don't they often use names of big schools or New York, securities firms? They try and use the reputation of universities or companies,
Sure.
right?
That happens too, and that happens probably nationwide. The problem here we have in Utah is unique to the Mormon Church, and what we usually see is people dropping, bishops' names or general authorities' names or their callings. Those are the most common things we see.
Okay.
And by the way, most of the people that they hit up, if you had a company you were trying to start, it would be normal for you to hit up the people in your neighborhood, your friends and neighbors for money to get your company going. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a fraud, but that's one of the sources you would go to, right? If you needed to raise a bunch of money. So it's not unusual. It's not anyone's fault. It's just the reality of the situation here. And it's the same reason we have so many multi-level marketing companies here, because people have big networks of friends and family that they hit up.
Yeah, but you just don't want to make an investment based on, relationships that are church connected, based solely on that.
Yes.
Or based solely on someone's claim to familial or institutional ties.
Exactly. If the strength of an investment should lie on the financials of the company, what the company's doing, how it's structured, who's doing it, the relationship with the church should have nothing to do with it. Obviously, you want to check out people's biographies. You want to know what their background is, whether they filed bankruptcy and stuff. But whether they were the bishop or the state president has nothing to do with an investment opportunity, and it should stay out. Okay,
so what's a Ponzi scheme?
So Ponzi scheme is where people start bringing in money, and a lot of these, I think, start innocently. If you were starting up a new, practice and you needed some money to fund it, a lot of times you'll go out and talk to your friends and family. You'll start raising money to fund your new company that you're going to start. And one of the ways people find that it's actually not that easy to get people's money. So one of the ways that they find that they can get it is by offering returns that are unusually high. So they'll say, you can put your money in the bank, you can put it in the stock market, but I'll pay you 10%, for instance, a year. 10% a year is good compared to what you would get in a lot of places. Then they guarantee it because people want guarantees, or they don't ever want to lose. So then what happens is gradually these cases...
Is that illegal to guarantee a return?
It's not. I wouldn't say it's technically illegal. You can secure an investment on real estate, for instance, and that's kind of a guarantee that if the investment goes bad, then you can foreclose on the property. But guarantees are something that happen all the time, more just to give people peace of mind. But it's hard to enforce it. You can give what's called a personal guarantee. You can even do it in writing. But frankly, if the company is going through the tubes, and if the investment and the individual running it are going down the drain with it, the odds of getting money through a personal guarantee are very low. So they're not worth much.
Okay. All right. I mean, at some point, a guarantee is like a loan, isn't it? You're basically guaranteeing some type of rate of return.
Right. It's not it would be more like if I gave you a loan and you promised me that you would pay it back for sure, no problem, I guarantee it, then that really doesn't give me a whole lot of peace of mind.
Yeah.
What often happens in these cases is people, because they have promised returns that are so high, they start paying them out. Word gets out that this guy's paying really good returns. He's paying 3% a month, whatever it would be. And so word gets around to the neighbors and friends. And as more money comes in, he has to make more payments. The reality is there's nothing there. The hallmark of a Ponzi scheme is there's no real underlying business, and that money's coming in from new investors and it's going out to the older investors. So money's coming in the door and we're going right back out. It's not actually going to run the business itself.
And aren't they skimming the money then to fund their own private sort of...
In many cases, lifestyle is what we actually hear. I mean, one of the other hallmarks you see of almost all these cases is an extravagant lifestyle that these guys are living. So they're taking money out, they're paying off investors, word gets out, more money comes in, goes back out. People aren't getting paperwork, they're not getting anything in writing, and they're just kind of trusting somebody. I've seen cases where people have given someone hundreds of thousands of dollars on a handshake.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me.
And part of the Lamborghini Ferrari sort of thing is to create the impression of success, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how does it typically happen? How does somebody get sucked in?
Well, it typically happens through what I just described, which is the word gets out through word of mouth. If there's someone in your ward who's driving a really, upgraded from a Camry to a Mercedes, and they're living a great lifestyle, and someone at church might say, "Hey, what are you doing? Where are you investing? What's going on?" Word gets out. Well, I've got this really great deal. I'm making all this money every month. I'm getting payments. He's never missed a payment. That's always the thing. Oh, he's never missed a payment. Well, yet. And so word gets out, and then other people want in because they're getting 3 to 5% if they're lucky on the stock market. At 5 would be really good. Most legitimate businesses don't pay 2 to 3% per month. It just doesn't happen. And even New York Wall Street firms don't consistently pay those kind of payments. And the reality is most new businesses can't return that kind of money on a regular basis right from the beginning. It takes a business years to get going. But when you hear people starting to make payments immediately on loans or on investments, that's a big red flag. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay. So you mentioned not getting statements. You meant, claims of never missing a payment, interest rates that are, returns that are too high, again, based on relationships and not on evidence.
Right.
A newly emerging sort of thing, right? Those are
Right.
all
People that tell you they're in a rush, we need the money right now. People that will not want to give you paperwork. That's one of the real common things, is that people, to put an investment in a company, you're supposed to get what's called a private placement memorandum. There's got to be all sorts of paperwork with all the risks and disclosures. And if you're just doing it all word of mouth and on a handshake, that's a big, big problem. The other thing that we see in a lot of these cases is people during their pitches, they talk about church stuff a lot. They drop church issues. They talk about their home teacher. They talk about their son being on a mission. We see people that are starting sales pitches with a prayer. So even though you're there in an investment pitch, they want to have a prayer before it starts, which I think ought to be a red flag. Guarantees, unusually high returns, discussing the scriptures in the context of an investment pitch. I heard a story once where one of the investigators said that the guy that was pitching the investment would always have tears running down his eyes, out of his eyes, as he would tell them what a wonderful blessing this could be and how much tithing and how they could help the church through the great opportunity that he was offering them. And this guy could turn on and off the tears in a second.
Yeah.
So very manipulative.
So our excessive reliance on emotion that sometimes we call the spirit, or sometimes, we don't, but that can be risky, relying on personality and emotion.
Yes.
And how someone makes us feel. Because obviously, if someone is able to make someone else feel really good, that's a way to manipulate them, right?
Right, yeah. Exactly. And it happens in church, and it happens outside of church too.
And then you mentioned no underlying business as being a concern. Now, really quickly, tell us the difference between a Ponzi scheme and a pyramid scheme.
They're really pretty much the same thing. There's usually two words that describe the same thing. And it's basically, and a lot of them start out with a real business, John. It's not like it's nothing from the outset, but the more money that comes in, the more then it goes out. Well, people talk about MLMs, and those are a little bit different, but okay.
Yeah. So talk about an MLM.
So an MLM, that's not what I do. I do mostly things that deal with investments, but MLMs, as you know, are money comes in. Then the only way you're going to get more money back or make money on it is to bring in new investors. And then those guys are encouraged to bring in more investors. A lot of these have a similar structure where someone starts up some sort of business, and then they pay people that invest, they pay them what's called a finder's fee in order to bring in new investments.
Okay.
And so that sometimes there's an MLM quality to these, but in most MLMs, there's actually a product that's getting sold. In a lot of my cases, they might start out with a company like a business of some sort, and we've got this product we're gonna do. But when it comes right down to it, the paying out of investors, money coming in and going back out, hardly any of it is going to the underlying business.
Okay. So if you were to say, well, give me all the paperwork that I need to know, give me all the information that I need to be able to decide whether or not to invest, what should you demand?
Well, and we can talk a little bit about that. And one of the things I would recommend is that if you're going to put in a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's definitely worth getting a corporate lawyer who can help you document it and review the documentation. But definitely you want to ask for financials. You want to ask for disclosures. You want to understand what the risks of the company are, and that usually is put forth in a document called a private placement memorandum.
Okay, yeah, that's what you talked about earlier.
And without getting into too much detail, they have to, in order to offer it legally, you have to either offer it through a broker or you have to use a private placement memorandum. And the reality is most of these scams don't even want to give you any paperwork except maybe a flashy brochure, but they're not going to document it all. But let me say this, just to be clear. Getting a lot of paperwork doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good investment. You still have to review it. You have to pay attention. You have to Google people's names. I always tell people, I've got a couple of these I'll talk about that if they would have just Googled the name of the guy that was hitting them up for money, they would have immediately seen that person had been already in prison twice for investment fraud. It seemed that would have been a huge red flag, but so many people don't even Google the person's name.
All right, well, let's jump in. You say you've got some of the war stories of the most prominent sort of fraudsters within Mormonism. Why don't we talk about some?
All right, sounds good. And let me just have a quick disclaimer, John, because a lot of these cases I'm going to talk about are my cases. I was involved in, I think, all but one of these cases in some way or another. In case some, I represented the bad guy. In some cases, I represent investors who have lost money. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm one of the only people in Utah that specializes in securities fraud. So a lot of these cases have come across my desk in one form or another. The information that I'm going to talk about here, though, is all going to be public information. I'm not going to talk about private information that I would have learned in the context of an attorney-client privilege situation.
Okay, good to know. All right.
Okay, so the first one I was going to talk about is one of the most renowned, famous, I guess you could say, and the reason for that is that it was a big one. It ran for a lot of time. It ran for 20 years. Over $180 million was lost through this, and this was through a guy named Val Southwick up in Ogden, Utah. And he was a real flashy guy. He had some real estate investments that he ran in Las Vegas and in Utah. The reality is that the investments that he was touting were not making as much money as he thought, as he told people. But some of the things that are interesting about this case, by the way, he was sued by the SEC in 2008, and February of 2008. When people would come in, and I have talked to many people who were pitched by Mr. Southwick, he told many investors that he was a former stake president, and in fact, that was not true. He'd never been a stake president. He showed, typically, if people were kind of not sure, one of the things he would do is he would give them his temple recommend. He would show them his temple recommend to demonstrate that he was a credible guy. He had, if you walked into his office, he had church memorabilia all throughout the office. He had a Liahona on his desk. He had a replica of the golden plates on his desk, and he had he had pictures of temples, I understand, and a number of pictures of him with general authorities framed on the wall. So the whole office, the minute you walked in, was built to generate a level of trust from people, because most of the people he was hitting up were members of the church. He did a couple things that were interesting. He had the missionaries come to his office every Friday to pray with his employees and also to any investors who happened to be in the office at the time. And then when they came, he would actually pay them between $50 and $100 cash for their trouble, the missionaries, and send them on their way. So if investors were in his office on Friday, he would bring them in for a very heartfelt prayer. One of the people that was indicted and convicted after the fact was a guy named Bill Hammonds, who was an LDS bishop in, I believe, Las Vegas, or maybe it was in Mesquite, but he was a bishop at the time. He made over $10 million selling these investments for Val Southwick, and he was later indicted and is, I believe, in prison now. One of the things we see a lot, and this will come up in a number of these cases, is that when Val Southwick and especially Hammonds was being sentenced, they would get letters from their ward members, their bishops, from their stake presidents, give them to the judge to show what a great person they are, how wonderful they are, and that they shouldn't spend time in prison because they're so wonderful. Many times that actually backfires because judges see that as, well, they don't like it. Yeah, very manipulative. Yeah. He told a lot of investors that his son was on a mission when he wasn't. He took over the last 6 years, he took $9 million in cash out of the company and had a fleet of 19 luxury vehicles, including Porsches, Ferraris, and Bentleys. And so he would drive them around and drive them to church. And there's a story from a person who was in his ward that told me once that he was in the young men's presidency, and every time they had an activity, he would cater it. So whether it was on Sunday or any other day. So he was a really flashy guy. He perpetuated his company for many, many years until he was shut down in 2008.
Okay.
So the next one is a guy out of Linden, Utah. So this is one of our Utah County cases. And this guy you might have seen in the news a couple of years ago. His name was Jeff Moen. And he was sued by the SEC in 2009. He raised approximately $41 million in a very, very short period of time. And he had this kind of deal where he said that you put your money into this CD in New Zealand and this bank in New Zealand, but it was actually fictitious from what I understand. He promised returns, get this, he promised his investors returns of as much as 30% a month. So people would say, wow, 30% a month, how awesome would that be? So they'll liquidate investments, they'll liquidate their 401ks to invest with this guy. Interestingly, he's one example where he actually had a criminal record. At the time that he raised this $40 million, he'd been convicted of securities fraud in 2003, 2004, 2007, and he also had a number of convictions for theft. So
how does he keep operating with a license?
He never had a license. None of these guys were ever licensed.
Wow.
So that's also something that you can do is you can talk to the Division of Securities or the SEC or FINRA and check whether they have a license. So he did not have a license. But because he had a name that was somewhat bad reputation and could be Googled, he used a number of people in his ward and his friends to go out and he paid them a finder's fee to bring investors in. And one of the pieces of evidence that they got in that case was a list of a number of ward directories where people had used their ward directory and then notations in the margin of how much money they'd raised from each person as they'd called all the people in their ward. So that was a case where a lot of money was raised very, very quickly from Utah County residents primarily. After he was charged criminally, he fled the country. And Jeff Moen was in Panama when the authorities picked him up. Somehow they found him in Panama and extradited him back to the United States. This case was in the news because a lot of the money that he raised, he put into cars, and he bought like hundreds of cars and had them in a warehouse in Bountiful. And I don't know if you remember this, but they opened up this warehouse for the news and they showed all these cars. He had a Batman car and an old car that was like the Dukes of Hazzard, and this is where he put his money. For whatever reason, he would buy old cars and put them all in a warehouse. Another thing that was interesting,
I have to imagine it's a way to take the really promising potential investors to just show them how successful you are. I mean, how else you could fly them to mansions, right? You could take them on a yacht, but I'm just thinking having a bunch of cars is just one way to...
It may be, or maybe he thought this was something that couldn't be traced or something. I have no idea. Yeah. I have no idea why he did this, but it wasn't hard for the SEC to find these, and they auctioned them all off. Yeah. There's another thing that was interesting about this case is that when he was in jail, he tried to hire an inmate that he was with to kill 4 key witnesses in his case. And so he ended up, that guy turned on him, and he ended up, he's probably serving more time because he tried to take out a hit on 4 witnesses in his case.
Ouch.
So yeah, not a good guy. But if you met him, you'd hear all about how great he was and what a strong member of the church he was. Okay, so this is one that's a brand new one, actually. This was just filed this year. And this involves a guy in Bountiful. And his name is Roger Bliss. And I've written this one up on my website, and most of these are up on my website, but this is one where he raised and lost very quickly $3.2 million of people in his ward, primarily up in Bountiful. He told investors that he had received annual returns of 100 to 300% per year, and that his average profits were about $920,000 a day. So people bought that. And it's crazy to me. And all he was doing was trading Apple stock, he said. But he said he had some sort of secret trading scheme through these dark pools where he was trading and no one else knew about it, and he was a specialized trader. None of that was true. And in fact, he told people he had $300 million that he was managing, and he didn't. He didn't have anywhere close to that. But no one asked him for documentation. No one asked him for proof. No one asked him for paperwork. And people gave him $3.2 million just basically on a handshake. He actually, when the SEC came in, he had told people that he had, what did he say? He told people he had $300 million in the bank and in his brokerage account. In fact, he had only $32,000 in his brokerage account. So he was just lying. And that guy has been, he was sued by the SEC in February of this year. So that one happened pretty quick. There's another, this one is out of Brigham City. Got a Brigham City case for you, almost Logan.
It's close to home, yeah.
Yeah, close to home. So this is a guy named Dean Udy, UDY. And he is, according to papers that were filed in the case, there were 1,500 investors who lost about $20 million with him. The interesting part about this case is that he was, at the time that he was raising all this money, he was a stake president and then a regional representative. So he was a regional representative during most of the time that this money was raised from investors and lost. So of the cases that I have, the one that's interesting about that, and I actually don't have any involvement in that case, but the interesting thing about it is that he was a very high-ranking church official and still was defrauding people every day. He and his son also were indicted by a grand jury in Las Vegas for bank fraud. So this is a bad guy who someone's discernment wasn't working with this guy. That's when they called him to be a general authority, I can tell you that. So
would he have been in one of the quorums of the 70 then?
Well, I think he was. This was in 2012.
Yeah.
And I think that was after. I'm trying to remember. I don't know the time off the top of my head when he was a regional rep, but he was either an area authority or maybe it was before they did that. Maybe it was when they used to have 70s or something. I don't know.
But once you've got that distinction, then you can. So yeah, 1987 he was appointed. I'm looking up at the website.
Okay.
1987 he was appointed as a regional rep. Okay, yeah.
So
which I think is like a third quorum of the 70 kind of thing.
Yeah, it was a high up guy. But apparently didn't see any conflict between his Sunday duties and what he was doing to people. And he did, from what I understand, use his church calling in his pitches. And obviously, if you're a stake president or a regional representative, you're going to have a high level of trust that you can achieve that other people wouldn't be able to do. And people are going to think, wow, he's a regional rep. He must be a great guy. I'm going to invest with him.
Tell me really quickly how someone maintains these scams for 10 or 12 years. How do they do it?
Well, part of the...
Without getting shut down.
Well, a lot of these things, what they do is they encourage people to keep the money in. So they will be sending out account statements that look like they're making more money. What they can't have is people pulling their money out because money's coming in. They're showing paper returns, but they're keeping it in there for their retirement someday. Meanwhile, more money's coming in. So the other thing is that if people are paying out returns that are too high, that's very hard to sustain. But people who are paying out 10% a year, it's more sustainable. Bernie Madoff raised, billions of dollars through this exact thing. He actually wasn't ever really trading any of the stocks that he claimed to be, but yet people people, investment pools and professional investors were putting money with this guy because his track record and his reputation were so good. And he kept that going for a long time. Val Southwick kept his going for a long time. And in some cases, he really did have investments and he had real estate that he was doing. Some of them really do have things that they do to show people. They can take people on tours. They can show how great it is. But when it comes right down to it, what they do is they have investment forensic investigators come in and they can show that the most of the money wasn't ever going into any particular thing. It was just kind of going in the door and right back out again to monthly payments. But a lot of them don't actually make the payments. They just show the payments on written statements. So people might think that their investment pool is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but the reality is the money's not there.
Okay, got it.
And by the way these things often blow up is in 2007, a lot of cases blew up because all of a sudden other investments or their job or something crashed and they needed to get their money out. And when people start pulling their money out of these, that's when they blow up.
Got it.
So another one I'm going to talk about is right actually near my house. This guy is a guy named Travis Wright, and he ran a company called Waterford Funding. The SEC sued him in 2010, and he had a very lavish lifestyle. He raised $145 million from just 175 investors. So small number of investments, very high number of, almost $1 million average per person. He promised returns of 24% per year. So very high returns. In fact, only a small amount of the money that he raised actually went into any investment at all. He used, according to the SEC filings, he used 15 million of that for personal use, including he bought the house of former jazz player Jeff Hornacek on Walker Lane. And the story that I've heard from people who are investigators in the case is that he didn't like where the pool was, so he moved the pool over 3 feet. Or something, or 5 feet. It was like he just moved the pool over, had it totally dug out, redone. He imported, those cobblestones from France, those square cobblestones that the streets are made out of, and had this imported driveway just for his driveway. And it was a $5 million home that he totally renovated. He was a big hunter and he collected guns and went on lots of safaris and things and had lots of trophies around his house. People, by the way, are going to know, some of the people that listen to this are going to hear, are going to recognize these cases. And I hope that they'll be putting some of the comments on your website, because I know people have personal details that I actually can't talk about. One of the classic details, though, I happen to know about that case is that when he was the scoutmaster, he wasn't in any high up church position, but he was the scoutmaster and took the scouts on some very lavish scout trips. When he was sentenced to prison, he brought his whole scout troop in their uniforms to the sentencing so that the judge could see what great guys these were that he'd helped. And I can tell you that did not go over very well. Again, that backfired. It's not always a good idea. So anyway.
All right.
So the next one isn't particularly interesting, except that this guy is named John Dudley. He's from Sandy, and he was criminally indicted in 2011. But one of the things that he did, his sales method was very like MLM. And what he would do is he would have investors, and then he would say to you, John, I'm going to pay you a fee if you'll invite some of your ward members to your house on Monday nights. And then we can have like a prayer, and I can pitch them on this investment in your home. So what he did is he actually leveraged the reputations of people that were investors to bring in other investors. So they might not have known him particularly, but because they knew John DeLynn and trusted him, he would leverage that to get more investors. So that happens a lot. He promised 5 to 10% per month. Again, all of these guys, if there's one pattern you'll see, they're offering returns that are outrageously high. He said it was a foreign exchange and it was very exclusive. Actually, he just used the money to buy 2 homes, a ski boat, airline tickets, gifts, trips, and mostly for his own use. So that one didn't last very long. It wasn't super big, but he was very clever in basically using the reputations of other people in order to gain trust. Again, the affinity fraud factor comes into play.
Okay.
There's one up in Denver that I want to talk about, mostly because it's a bigger case. It involves $21 million. He's serving 12 and a half years in prison. His name is Shawn Merriman. He was a bishop. One of the interesting things, though, that he did with the money, he was a big art collection. And so he used people's money to buy art. What did he do with this art? He had some of it in his house, but what he would do is he actually had a moving art collection that was posted in LDS ward houses throughout Colorado. So he had very, very expensive art by world-renowned masters, and he would have it in ward houses all around in his stake where he lived, and maybe bigger than that. And then he would have, I think, his name somehow posted that this was Mr. Merriman's art collection, and he would use that to gain more investors. The government seized $4 million in fine art, antique cars, sports memorabilia, and animal trophies from his safaris. So his art exhibit was called The Renaissance of Faith in Art, and it included Rembrandt, Rubens, and Dürer pictures. So very wonderful, expensive $1 million paintings that were hung in ward houses to promote faith.
Wow.
So he was indicted. SEC complaint was filed in 2009. So this was a few years ago. Another more recent one that the SEC filed was against a guy out of Fountain Green, Utah. So this is the furthest south in Utah. And it was against someone named Wendell Jacobson, and they sued his son as well. The allegation in the SEC complaint was that he raised $200 million from more than 400 investors. He was, according to the SEC complaint, a bishop in a Snow College student ward at the time that he raised a lot of this money, at least when he was shut down. And also they alleged that he told many people that church leaders, including members of the Quorum of the 12, were investors in his company. That may or may not have been true, but that was what he was doing. He did invest in apartment complexes, and the interesting thing about that is that, and this is one where I'm not sure it was a Ponzi scheme. The SEC has said that it is. It's not clear to me that it was. And in fact, he did have a lot of apartment buildings, and that money's been now returned to investors. They sold all the apartments, and investors, from my understanding, have received 100% on their dollar, which in most cases, when they get shut down by the SEC, they appoint a receiver. The receivers try to liquidate everything and get the money back to investors. And most investors in a Ponzi scheme get cents on the dollar, like 10 cents if you're lucky. So this was an unusual one that way. So okay. The last one I was going to talk about actually is Joseph Smith, and it's interesting that I'm not a historian, so I won't, I'm not a pro at this. You might know more about this than I do, but he started a bank called the Kirkland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. He called it, and I've read about this, and it's a fascinating story because in fact it was an illegal bank. He used it to gain money from church members, and raised looks like $30,000, which in those days was a lot of money. Later, he used it for various things, and then the bank failed, and he was named in 17 lawsuits. And then, of course, that had a fallout in the church. So that's the last story I was going to tell, John. But the thing that's interesting about this to me is that this was the Joseph Smith anti-banking, or the Kirkland Safety Society, was long before Charles Ponzi ever gave the name Ponzi scheme. And yet, in a lot of ways, what Joseph Smith did back in Kirtland was a Ponzi scheme. And the fallout of that was that a lot of people left the church. And the fallout of a lot of these modern ones is the same. Many people leave the church over it. People become disillusioned. People become frustrated. They think that if they put their trust in a church member, if you can't trust a church member, who can you trust? And it's sad. It's sad because, unfortunately, the church culture, I think, puts a premium on financial and worldly success. And people then try to do that. They look for any way to kind of work up the church ladder. And sometimes having a nice house and driving a nice car can help you to get into those positions, unfortunately.
So do you think Mormons are more gullible for some reason? If there's gullibility, what do you think the roots of the gullibility are?
So in Mormonism, it's a big religion. There's a lot of people, and there's very sophisticated people who are, CPAs. I mean, Mitt Romney obviously is a brilliant guy and very sophisticated investor. I know many members of the church who are extremely sophisticated and would never fall for one of these things. The problem is a lot of these schemes, those aren't who they're going after. The real sophisticated, I mean, I've never been hit up on one of these because people kind of know who I am and they know that I know what to look for. But someone who's less sophisticated, someone who doesn't understand the niceties of complying with the SEC regulations, those are the ones that they're typically targeting. And a lot of them come from people's 401ks. People would often be advised to move their 401ks into a company called American Pension Services, which would let them invest in other things. This year, American Pension Services turned out that the guy who ran that stole $24 million from it. So you can't even trust sometimes the companies that are managing your money for you. There's the main thing that you'll see in all of these cases is that people were not licensed to sell. And one of the ways that you can check this is you can go on the SEC's website, you can go on FINRA's website and check their licenses. And
FINRA?
FINRA, yeah, the Financial Industry Regulatory Association. FINRA used to be called NASD, and they're the ones that license stockbrokers. So you can check to see if someone has a license, but most of these people do not, and that's the problem.
Okay. Now you mentioned in your program notes people living double lives. What is it that you see as being important about that?
Well, you tell me. I mean, what do you think about that? You've seen that. Haven't you seen that in your practice or in your personal experiences? I mean, people who might act one way during the day, and they might be gay. People who are the bishop, and they are going out on the weekends with men. I mean, there's a lot of times, and maybe that's not unique to Mormon culture, but it does seem that we have a problem with people who are kind of having this dual personality. They're one guy at church and they're a different guy during the week, and I see that a lot. The other thing that I see is that people will use their position in the church, but they'll also feel that if they keep paying tithing and if they keep their temple recommend current, if they go through all these niceties that the church has a certain number of recommend questions. One of them is, are you honest with your fellow man? And unfortunately, I think people fudge that one. They might pay their tithing and do some of the outward things, but it's easy to say I feel good about my business dealings when in fact they're stealing money. And not all these people, I think, feel that they're doing anything wrong. A number of my clients that I've represented before the SEC insist till the day is done that they are honest people, good members of the church. And unfortunately, if they're not following the law and they're not doing, and they may not be right, but they might not know it.
So you've represented the bad guys?
Oh yeah.
And the good guys?
Both.
Victims. Yeah. And what's that like representing the perpetrators? I mean, I honestly, some of the listeners might be turned off by that, but our legal system requires that everyone have representation, right? Well, somebody's got to do it.
Right. And there's not a lot of people in Utah that represent people before the SEC, and I'm one of them. And so I get calls. They're very hard cases. They're hard cases for a lot of different reasons, and it's hard to get into it and understand that people have been harmed. And it's hard to see. Sometimes you have clients that you don't always trust what they're telling you is true. And I can't talk about specific circumstances, but I can tell you that that's certainly one of the challenges. And I get frustrated. I've gotten disillusioned over the years. I've gotten a little cynical about people because of it. But I see both sides. My favorite kind of case is actually to help people who who have been victimized, because there are sometimes ways that you can go and try to get their money back. And that's one of the things I do, and I'm trying to move my practice more into helping victims than helping bad guys. But I've done both.
But you do both because that's kind of the domain. You kind of have to specialize, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about kind of the warning signs. We'll just review. I've heard, excessive rates of return, promises on a handshake, lack of documentation, lack of licensure, excessive reliance on religious or other sort of ways of manipulating through influence or reputation.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Those you've hit all the main ones. A lot of them also talk about things that are very complex, like offshore trading or currency trading or commodities, and they'll say they've got a certain system. I see that a lot where people are saying, I've got this special system and no one else has it, and if you invest with me, I'm going to make you millions of dollars, and I'm making other people millions. And in fact, that's not true. But people, when it sounds too complicated, they often don't look into it. And the other thing that people often have is a friend or a family member who's already invested, and they'll say, well, so-and-so checked into this because they're a smart guy or a smart woman, and so they must have done the homework, so I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to trust that they did the homework. And that's a really bad idea.
Okay.
Really bad idea.
All right. And so let's say that you are approached for one of these things. What can you do? I mean, obviously you can say, no, I'm not interested. What else is there beyond that?
So you can, and if you are interested, and certainly there are people out there that have genuinely legitimate opportunities. And I wouldn't say that anyone who approaches you for an investment is going to defraud you. I think, though, that it's really important to be careful. And if you see any of these red flags that you just mentioned, guarantees, really high returns, those are the two. Really high returns in particular, and then people talking about church. If you see those things happen, just slow the thing down, because a lot of times people try to push you into it very quickly. And so I would say, look, I'm going to take the time. I need to get all your paperwork. I'm going to Google your name. I'm going to do my research. I'm going to talk to my attorney. I'm going to do a lot of things to look into it, because I'm just saying, anyone who is asking for $100,000 or $50,000 of your hard-earned money, you don't want to hand that over unless you've done your homework. You've got to protect yourself.
So can they hire someone like you to do that due diligence?
Yeah, it's not really what I do. I sometimes help people vet things, but that's not really what there's a lot of attorneys do corporate law and do securities investments.
Okay.
And any lawyer hopefully would be able to help you vet the thing, look through the documents, make sure their paperwork is there. Lawyers also have access to databases, so they can look at whether so-and-so's been sued or not, whether their company's in litigation, whether they filed bankruptcy. All of those things are available to a lawyer who can look into the kind of their history.
Okay.
And that's a good idea.
And then what if you are listening to this podcast and you realize you or someone you love is actually in one of these scams right now? Okay. What do you do?
So this is really where the rubber meets the road, and I think it's important for people to know that there is help out there. A lot of times, if you're in an investment scam right now, when the economy is going good, you might not know it. And you might be getting your monthly payments every month, but you could indeed be in a scam, especially if these returns are super high. So what I would say is, first of all, talk to a lawyer. And if everything's going great, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will continue to go great. So it used to be that I would get calls from people periodically that their grandmother or their parents were in a scam, and they would say, hey, help me get them out. And I would say, well, let's talk to the SEC, but the victims wouldn't want to do it, because the victims want the scheme to keep going. They want it to perpetuate itself, because the only way they're going to get their money back is if the scheme continues on, right? So they were very reluctant to talk to anyone, because they don't want to throw a wrench into the gears that are seemingly going just fine. That was changed about 3 years ago, when the SEC and the state have both passed what's called whistleblower laws. So a big part of my practice now is helping people who are aware of a scam, people who maybe work for a company that they think is a scam. They can actually get a financial award for reporting that to the SEC or to the state and getting it stopped before the whole thing blows up. And that's really important because the SEC has the ability to shut these things down when they're in operation before all the money disappears. The problem is mostly the ones that blow up when the economy tanks, the money's gone and it's way too late and no one's ever going to get their money back. So if you know someone who's involved in one of these, have them talk to a lawyer who understands whistleblower cases. If you work for a company that you think is perpetuating a scam, talk to a lawyer who does whistleblower cases, because those kind of lawyers can help you go proactively to the state in the SEC and shut it down, and you can get paid as much as 30% of whatever the fines are they collect under certain circumstances. So there's a lot of fine print on that, but this is a big part of a growing way to enlist the public and try to find these cases because they want to shut them down before it all blows up. Also, if the people are affiliated with a brokerage firm or if they're affiliated with a company, a bank or someplace, sometimes there can be a big company that you can go after. And those opportunities are sometimes there, but sometimes not. So there's things you can do, but not always.
Okay. Does the name Rick Korber mean anything to you?
Yeah, that was, the smart story that I told you right up front, that was Rick Korber.
Oh, okay. You didn't mention his name though.
Yeah, he had that website, Free Capitalist, and he was a guy that did not get indicted, but they're still kind of going after him. So yeah.
I actually have neighbors that apparently lost hundreds of thousands of dollars from that guy. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He had a thing where he was doing equity skimming, he called it. And so you would give him your money and he would buy houses and fix them up. And he had all these things and the pitch was very, very attractive. But people lost hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the stories I've liked about Rick Korber is that he was really good at having big parties at his house with his Maseratis parked out front. But then the investors, what they didn't realize is that their money had bought that car that they were looking at, and then he would give them hot dogs. So yeah, he was, and one of his associates was just indicted as well. So that case actually is ongoing, but that's one of the big ones. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I just had that memory right at the end.
Yeah.
All right. Well, your name is Mark Pugsley. The website, or the law firm for you is Ray Quinney Nebeker. The website is utahsecuritiesfraud.com. But I'm hopeful that this podcast will help some people either avoid losing a bunch of money or maybe get out while the going's good before they lose too much. Me too. Yeah. All right. Well, Mark, I appreciate you joining us on Mormon Stories and sharing your expertise. I'll thank our listeners for their support of Mormon Stories. Want to encourage them to go to mormonstories.org. As Mark said, if you know any of these guys, and they're almost all guys, and you have any details of the cases, please share them at mormonstories.org. If you know of other cases or even ongoing cases, it'd be fun to have you list them in the comment section as well. And just most importantly, let's try and become more aware about these sorts of things. And awareness sort of begins by talking about it. So, Mark, thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories. My pleasure. Thanks, John. All right, and listeners, join us again. Thanks for your financial support. It's what makes this possible. And please join us again soon on mormonstories.org. Thanks again, and have a happy new year. And